The waiting room was buzzing with the usual hum of hospital life, the faint rustling of papers, the distant clink of metal, and the soft murmur of voices. But amid the noise, there was a silence surrounding him. A small black boy, no older than 8, sat with his grandmother, clutching her hand as they waited for his name to be called. His big brown eyes flicked nervously around the room, scanning the faces, but none of them felt familiar. None of them seemed to see him. The grandmother, sitting beside him, was sharp-eyed and alert. Her grey hair was tied neatly in a bun, her back straight, her hands folded with an air of quiet authority. She had seen too much of the world to let her guard down. She knew how people looked at her grandson before they even spoke. She knew how the world sometimes made him feel invisible. But today was supposed to be different. Today the boy had an appointment. Today he would finally get the help he needed for the constant pain in his legs. Yet as they sat there, the familiar anxiety crept over her. She had lived long enough to know when things didn't feel right. And as the nurse, a white woman about in her 30s, stepped up to call for the next patient, the grandmother's instincts tightened. "Jackson Hill!" The nurse's voice was sharp, cutting through the low chatter of the room. The boy looked up, his eyes meeting the nurse's, then flicking to his grandmother's face for reassurance. She gave him a nod, but as he stood up, she noticed something in the nurse's gaze. Something cold, something dismissive. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the unease spread through her like a dark cloud. The nurse didn't wait for the boy to approach her. She turned abruptly and began walking down the hallway without even looking back, her steps quick and impersonal. The boy hesitated for a moment, unsure, but his grandmother's reassuring grip on his hand urged him to follow. He tried his best to keep up with the nurse's brisk pace, his small legs struggling to catch up with her long strides. As they walked deeper into the hospital, the grandmother's eyes never left the nurse. The woman seemed unaware of the sharp gaze burning into her back, or perhaps she didn't care. The boy, still uneasy, glanced up at the nurse, his voice trembling. "Is my grandma coming?" The nurse didn't answer at first. She didn't even look down at him. When she finally spoke, her words were clipped, like they were an inconvenience to her. "She'll wait in the waiting area. You're fine on your own." The boy looked back at his grandmother, his eyes wide with uncertainty, but she only smiled back, trying to reassure him. "It's okay. Go ahead. I'll be right here." The nurse opened the door to a small examination room. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit the boy's nose as he stepped inside, feeling small in the cold, clinical space. The nurse motioned for him to sit on the examination table, her eyes never softening. She didn't smile, didn't ask how he was feeling. It was as if he was just another patient to process, another task to get through. She began with his blood pressure, her hands brisk, the cuff too tight around his small arm. He winced at the discomfort, but she didn't acknowledge it. She didn't acknowledge anything about him, not even his discomfort. Her mind was elsewhere. "I don't need any help," she muttered to herself, the words barely audible. "Shouldn't even be here." The boy flinched, not understanding fully, but feeling the sting of the words in the air around him. Why did she speak like that? Was he in the way? Did she think he didn't deserve to be there? The thoughts swirled in his head, but he didn't dare ask. He just sat there, staring at his own hands, trying not to cry. But the nurse didn't seem to care. She finished the checkup without a second glance at him, barely speaking as she moved from task to task. Each step felt colder, more impersonal. Every motion she made seemed to say he wasn't worth her time, that he was nothing more than a routine to be done as quickly as possible. She turned to him, finally looking down at him, her expression devoid of warmth. "I'll be back in a moment," she said, without a hint of care. "Don't move." The boy nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to think, didn't know how to feel. All he knew was that something was wrong. He felt it deep in his gut, the way she had treated him, the way her eyes had flicked over him like he was invisible. And all the while, his grandmother sat just outside, her gaze sharp as a hawk, waiting for the moment when her grandson would need her. Unseen by the nurse, but not invisible. Not to her. The tension hung heavy in the air, the fragile peace of the waiting room shattered by the cold silence in the examination room. The boy, alone in a room full of strangers, waited, not knowing the storm that was about to unfold. The door to the examination room clicked shut behind the nurse, leaving the boy alone in the cold, sterile space. His small frame felt even smaller in the oversized room, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The ticking of the clock on the wall, seemed louder in the silence. He sat on the examination table, the crinkling of the paper beneath him, making him feel uncomfortable, out of place. His hands were clenched tightly in his lap, his fingers digging into his jeans. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, his chest rising and falling faster than usual. The unease that had been building in him since the nurse had first looked at him had now transformed into a knot in his stomach. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the sterile equipment that lined the walls. Syringes, thermometers, bandages, all tucked away in their boxes, just waiting to be used. But it wasn't the medical instruments that made him nervous. It was the nurse, her cold demeanor, the way she had dismissed him from the moment he had entered the room. It was the look she had given him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, as if he was a burden, an inconvenience to be dealt with as quickly as possible. The boy shifted on the table, wincing as the pain in his legs flared up again. His hands instinctively rubbed his knees, trying to ease the discomfort. It had been happening for weeks now, sharp, stabbing pains that seemed to come out of nowhere and make it impossible for him to walk without limping. He had tried to ignore it, tried to be strong, but the pain had grown worse, until finally, his grandmother insisted they come to the hospital. He had hoped, prayed, that today would be the day they would find out what was wrong and help him. But as he sat there, waiting in the sterile room with its harsh lighting and impersonal walls, he wasn't sure anymore. Was he really going to get help, or was he just being ignored again, like always? His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again, and the nurse reappeared. This time, she didn't look at him as she entered. She didn't greet him with a warm smile or even a simple hello. Instead, she walked in with a clipboard in her hand, glancing down at the papers as she muttered something under her breath. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. The boy's heart sank as he watched her approach. He didn't want to speak up, didn't want to draw attention to himself again, but the frustration was building inside him. Why did she treat him like this? Why was she so cold, so distant, so uncaring? Okay, let's get this over with, the nurse said, not looking up from the clipboard. Just a quick check, it won't take long. She barely glanced at him as she moved to the side, preparing the instruments. She didn't ask him how he was feeling. She didn't offer any comfort. There was no warmth in her voice, just an efficient, clinical tone that felt almost cruel. The boy felt a knot in his throat. He didn't know why, but the coldness of her attitude hurt him more than he expected. The pain in his legs didn't hurt as much as the pain of being treated like he didn't matter. Can you just look at me? The boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse froze for a second, her eyes still focused on the clipboard, but she didn't answer. He could see the way she was avoiding him, the way she was purposefully pretending he wasn't there. He wasn't sure if she was being cruel on purpose, or if it was just how she acted toward people like him. He didn't know. Can you please tell me what's wrong? He asked, his voice a little louder this time, his eyes pleading with her. She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as if she had been disturbed. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something almost imperceptible, but it quickly faded, replaced with the same cold indifference she had worn since the beginning. It's nothing really, she said dismissively. You're just another child with some growing pains. You're fine. Just relax. The boy's heart sank. He had heard that before. Just growing pains, they'd say. His grandmother had said that he needed to be checked out, that something wasn't right, but here he was again, being dismissed. She began to check his blood pressure without another word. Her hands were rough, unkind. He winced as the cuff tightened around his arm, but she didn't seem to care. His breath caught in his throat as the thought crept into his mind. She doesn't care about me. She doesn't even see me. The words were like a punch to his chest. He was so used to being invisible, to being ignored, but the hurt still stung. It was like a bitter reminder that the world didn't see him, didn't care about him. The nurse finished with the blood pressure cuff and moved to the next task, all while muttering under her breath, as if to herself, I really don't know why we're wasting time on this. The boy's hands clenched tighter in his lap, his fingernails digging into his palms. He wanted to say something. He wanted to scream at her. Why am I here if you don't even want to help me? But the words stuck in his throat. He felt small, insignificant, powerless. Instead, he just sat there, letting her work in silence, the weight of her indifference pressing down on him like a stone. But then, just as she finished taking his temperature, the nurse turned away from him without a word, grabbing her clipboard again. "I'll be right back with the doctor," she said, her voice still cool, but there was something different in her tone now, something like she couldn't be bothered to even pretend to care. "Wait here." The door clicked shut behind her, and the boy was left alone again in the room, the silence swallowing him whole. He didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes? Hours? The world outside felt distant, like it wasn't meant for him. He wasn't sure if he could take much more of this. The feeling of being invisible, the feeling of being treated like he didn't matter, it was suffocating. But then, just as his mind was starting to spiral, he heard something. A voice. The grandmother's voice, soft and steady, cutting through the stillness of the room. She was in the hallway just outside the door. She had been waiting patiently, but now her voice carried with it an edge of urgency. "You can't just treat him like that," she was saying, her words sharp with something unfamiliar. "He's not your problem to ignore. He deserves more than your cold indifference." The boy's heart skipped a beat. His grandmother was here. She was finally speaking up. She was finally fighting for him. The door to the examination room opened again, and this time it wasn't the nurse who entered. It was his grandmother, her eyes fierce, her posture straight, demanding attention. The nurse followed behind her, looking uncomfortable, but it was clear who held the power in the room now. "You're not treating him properly," the grandmother said, her voice carrying the weight of years of struggle. "He's a child, and he deserves kindness. He deserves care, not your dismissal." The nurse's face flushed with a mixture of guilt and anger, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood there, silently, as the grandmother's words hung in the air like an accusation. The boy looked up at his grandmother, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a sense of shame he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't his fault, but the weight of the world felt heavier on his shoulders than ever before. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. But the fight was just beginning. The tension in the room was palpable. The boy's grandmother stood in the doorway, her eyes locked onto the nurse, who now avoided her gaze. The silence between them felt like an eternity. Every breath the grandmother took seemed to echo, and the boy, sitting on the examination table, could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His grandmother was not the type to speak out unless absolutely necessary, but he had never seen her so fierce, so unyielding. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped in front of her. She had expected to just do her job, perform the routine and be done with it. But now, with the grandmother standing there, she realized that this situation was different. It wasn't just about a simple checkup anymore. It was about a fight for dignity, for respect, something the boy had been denied since the moment he walked into this hospital. And now, with the grandmother's voice cutting through the air like a blade, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth she had been avoiding. "I've watched my grandson suffer," the grandmother began, her voice steady but heavy with years of pain. "I've watched him hurt in ways that no child should. And today, when he needs help, when he's vulnerable, you turn him away with nothing but indifference." The nurse didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her eyes flicking from the grandmother to the boy, her face unreadable. It was clear that she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be called out, to be held accountable for the way she had treated them. She had probably assumed that, like so many others, they would simply take whatever was handed to them and be grateful for it. But they weren't going to be grateful. Not anymore. "Why?" the grandmother pressed. "Why treat him this way? What gives you the right to dismiss him? To treat him like he's not worthy of your attention? What makes him any different from the other children in this hospital?" The nurse opened her mouth, but no words came out. She hadn't expected this confrontation. She hadn't prepared herself for someone to challenge her so directly. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by people like them, people who had always been invisible, people who were supposed to stay in the background, unnoticed, never demanding anything. But the grandmother wouldn't let it go. She stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving the nurse's face. The boy watched, wide-eyed, feeling a mix of fear and awe. His grandmother had always been his protector, but seeing her stand up to someone like this made him feel like something inside of him was growing stronger too. "I don't care if you've seen hundreds of children in this hospital today," the grandmother continued, her voice growing louder, more powerful with each word. My grandson deserves the same care, the same compassion as any other child in this hospital. He deserves to be treated like a human being, not like an object to be ignored. The nurse still didn't speak. She could feel the weight of the grandmother's words, but she didn't know how to respond. She had been trained to be detached, to focus on the task at hand, not to engage with the people she was treating on a personal level. She had never learned to look beyond the surface, beyond the skin, to see the person in front of her. The grandmother's voice softened, but the sharpness in it remained. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that because of the color of my grandson's skin, he's not worth your time. You're thinking that he's just another black child, that he's not as important as the others. I've seen it all before. I've lived it all before. But I will not let you do it to him. For the first time, the nurse looked directly at the boy. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the hurt that he tried to hide, and the pain that he had been carrying with him. But instead of looking away, she held his gaze for a brief moment, and in that instant, something flickered in her eyes. Something like regret. Or was it guilt? The grandmother's words had struck a chord, but the nurse didn't know how to reconcile her own thoughts with what was happening right in front of her. The boy felt a wave of emotion surge through him. He had never been the center of attention like this before. Never had anyone stand up for him in such a forceful way. He had always been taught to keep his head down, to stay out of the way, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But now, with his grandmother standing up for him, he felt like something inside of him was awakening. The hurt he had carried with him for so long, the sting of rejection, of being overlooked, of being treated like he was less than, began to dissolve, just a little. He wasn't invisible anymore, not to his grandmother, not to the world. I'm sorry, the nurse finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken since the confrontation began, and the words felt hollow, inadequate. She had said the words so many times before, to so many others, but now they felt different. They felt empty. The grandmother didn't move. She didn't soften. She had heard apologies like this before. Empty words meant to placate, meant to cover up the real issues. She wasn't interested in apologies. She was interested in change. Sorry doesn't fix the harm you've done, the grandmother said, her voice cold and firm. Sorry doesn't make up for the fact that you treated my grandson like he didn't matter. Sorry doesn't take away the hurt, the humiliation, the feeling that he's not worth anything to you. The nurse looked down, unable to meet the grandmother's eyes. For a moment she felt exposed, like her very soul had been laid bare. She didn't know how to deal with this moment. She had never been forced to confront the ugliness of her own biases, her own assumptions. She had never been held accountable for the way she had treated people like the boy. People who had always been invisible to her, people who had always been less than. The boy's grandmother stepped closer, her eyes never leaving the nurse's face. You may never understand what it's like. You may never understand the weight of the life we've had to live. But one thing I know is this: my grandson deserves more than this, and I won't stand by and let you make him feel like he's nothing. For a moment, the room was silent. The tension in the air hung like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. The boy sat on the table, watching the exchange between his grandmother and the nurse, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood one thing. His grandmother wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Finally, the nurse spoke again, her voice shaky. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, the question laced with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. The grandmother's gaze softened, but the edge in her voice remained. "I want you to treat him like he matters. I want you to do your job, but I want you to do it with dignity, with respect. I want you to see him, not just another patient, but him, a child who deserves care, just like anyone else in this hospital." The nurse nodded slowly, her eyes still on the ground. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. As the grandmother turned to leave, she reached for the boy's hand, her fingers wrapping around his with an unspoken promise. She had done what she had to do. She had made her point, and no matter what happened next, she would continue to fight for him, for his dignity, for his right to be seen. The boy, still processing the storm of emotions he felt, looked up at her with a quiet smile. It wasn't a smile of relief or joy, but one of understanding. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew this. He wasn't invisible anymore. He had someone in his corner, and that was enough. The chapter ends with a quiet, powerful moment of connection between the boy and his grandmother. The tension of the confrontation has shifted, but the underlying issues are far from resolved. The nurse, though reluctantly moved, hasn't fully come to terms with her actions. The journey of understanding, of accountability, has only just begun. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear where you're listening to our stories from, and if you've ever experienced something similar in your life. Your stories matter to us, and your thoughts mean a lot. Please consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Now let's continue. The boy sat in the waiting room, his grandmother by his side, her hand gripping his with a steadying force he could feel deep in his chest. The echoes of what had happened in the examination room, his grandmother's confrontation with the nurse, the shame in the nurse's eyes, and the boy's own confusion, were still swirling in his mind. He felt both relieved and unsettled at the same time. It was as if his world had been turned upside down in the span of just a few minutes. His grandmother had always been the calm center of his life, the person who told him everything would be okay, even when it wasn't. But today, he saw her in a new light. She'd always fought for him, protected him, but today, she had gone beyond that. She had challenged the world around them, the system that continually made people like them feel less than. Yet, as much as he tried to understand what had just happened, the boy couldn't escape the heaviness in his chest. The nurse's coldness still stung, the way she treated him like a nuisance. Her dismissive attitude, her cruel assumptions, it wasn't something he could easily shake off, and it wasn't just her, it was the whole world around him. Everywhere he went, there was the lingering sense that he was just another black child, invisible in the eyes of those who held power. He looked up at his grandmother, who was now quietly observing the room, her eyes sharp, scanning everything and everyone. She noticed the way people would glance away when they saw her looking their way, the way they would speak just a little louder when they talked about someone else, someone who wasn't her. She had seen it all before, but today, her quiet observation wasn't just about surviving the situation. Today, she was waiting for something more. The door to the examination room opened, and the nurse walked out, her face flushed, her eyes darting around nervously as she adjusted her white coat. She didn't even look at the grandmother as she passed by, but the boy saw the way her eyes lingered on him, the guilt etched across her face. He saw her hesitation, the way she seemed unsure of herself now. He wanted to feel satisfaction, to feel like justice had been done, but instead, he just felt more confused. The nurse walked briskly to the desk near the entrance, where a doctor stood waiting. He was a middle-aged man, tall with greying hair, and he looked up as the nurse approached. They exchanged a few quick words, and the nurse's voice was low, almost hesitant as she spoke to him. The boy couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension in the air was thick enough that he felt it in his bones. The nurse's discomfort was palpable, and the doctor's cold indifference was just as clear. The grandmother, though, noticed something else. She noticed how the nurse's gaze flicked back toward them, toward her grandson, before she hurried off toward the back of the clinic. There was something about the way she walked away, something about the way she tried to avoid confrontation, as if she had been caught. It didn't feel like an apology, it felt like shame. But for the boy, the confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot. The boy's attention was drawn back to his grandmother, who was now watching him with soft, knowing eyes. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she leaned down to his level, her warm hands gently resting on his shoulders. "I know that was hard," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know what that feels like. But listen to me, Jackson. You are not invisible. You are not less than. And you do not have to take anyone's disrespect, no matter who they are." He looked up at her, his small face full of confusion and unease. "But Grandma, she was just being mean. She didn't care about me." "I know," she said softly, brushing a lock of his hair away from his forehead. "And that's exactly why we can't be silent. Because when people like her get away with treating us like that, it just continues. They think they can make us feel small because of who we are. But we don't let them, not anymore." The boy swallowed, his throat tight. He had heard these kinds of things before, but today they felt different. His grandmother's words were more than just comforting advice. They felt like a call to action. He realized in that moment that he wasn't just an innocent child anymore. He was a part of something bigger than himself, something much bigger than he had ever realized. The door to the examination room opened once more, and the doctor entered the waiting area, his expression neutral, but his eyes scanning the room carefully. He looked at the boy, then at the grandmother, then back at the boy again. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Mrs. Hill," he said, his voice calm but cool. "We're ready for you now. I'm Dr. Miller. Please follow me." The boy looked up at his grandmother, sensing the shift in the room. She stood up, offering him a reassuring smile, and they both followed Dr. Miller into the back of the clinic. The nurse was nowhere to be seen, and the boy felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe now, with the doctor, things would be different. The doctor led them down a narrow hallway to a small office. It was sparsely decorated, with only a few chairs and a desk in the corner. A small, pale light flickered above them, casting an unwelcoming glow on the white walls. Dr. Miller motioned for them to sit. "So, Mrs. Hill," he began, sitting down across from them, "I understand there have been concerns about your grandson's leg pain. What seems to be the issue?" The grandmother didn't waste time. "My grandson has been complaining about pain in his legs for the past several weeks," she said, her voice firm. "We've been to other doctors, but they just dismissed us. They said it was nothing, growing pains or some other nonsense. But it's only getting worse. His legs hurt, he's limping, and he's afraid to move sometimes." Dr. Miller looked at the boy with a calm, analytical gaze, as if trying to assess him not just physically, but emotionally. The boy met his gaze, trying to hold his ground. There was something different about this doctor. He didn't seem to be looking down on them, didn't seem to be assuming anything. He was just listening. "Jackson," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "Can you tell me where it hurts? Can you show me?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Slowly, he reached down to touch his left leg, just below the knee, where the pain often started. He didn't need to explain it. The doctor understood immediately. "Doctor," Miller leaned forward, examining the boy's leg carefully. His movements were deliberate, patient. "It looks like there may be some inflammation," he said after a moment, his eyes flicking to the grandmother. "We'll need to run some tests to be sure, but this could be something as simple as an injury or a joint problem, or it could be something more serious. I'll make sure we get the right tests done." The boy looked at his grandmother, his heart pounding. He could feel the tension lifting just a little. This doctor wasn't dismissing him. He was listening, really listening. He wasn't assuming anything about him, about his race, about his place in the world. He was just treating him like a person. The grandmother nodded, her face softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of quiet relief. "That's all we've been asking for." Dr. Miller smiled, offering a kind, reassuring gesture. "Of course, you're his advocate. You're the one who knows when something's wrong. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." But as the boy sat there, watching the exchange between his grandmother and the doctor, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just the relief of finally being taken seriously. It was something deeper, something stronger. This man, this doctor, had shown him what it felt like to be treated with respect. And that feeling, the feeling of being seen, was something he would never forget. But outside, in the world beyond this office, things hadn't changed. People like the nurse, like those who dismissed him, still existed. The world still had so much work to do, and the boy knew, in that moment, that he wasn't just going to be a passive observer anymore. He wasn't going to let the world forget him. He wasn't going to let anyone treat him like he didn't matter. This was just the beginning. The weeks after the doctor's visit passed in a blur. The boy's legs still hurt, though it wasn't as constant as before. The pain had become more intermittent, coming in waves that left him limping at times, and others where he could move almost freely. But he didn't forget what had happened in that examination room. He didn't forget the nurse's coldness, the dismissive way she had treated him. It lingered, a constant reminder that, for all the care he had received from the doctor, the world outside wasn't always so kind. His grandmother had kept a close eye on him, as she always did, making sure he didn't overexert himself, checking for signs of swelling or discomfort. She was still fighting for him in every way she knew how, still making sure he didn't feel like a burden. But there was a quiet determination in her that had never been there before. It was as if the confrontation at the clinic, the exchange with the nurse, had ignited something deeper within her. Something that was slowly beginning to shape how she viewed the world around her. And it wasn't just the boy who had changed. Every time they walked down the street, the grandmother could feel the subtle stares of passers-by, the flickers of judgment in the eyes of strangers. the way people often seemed to avoid eye contact when they saw her coming. She had lived with it for years, this quiet, unspoken form of racism that people didn't acknowledge, but that everyone understood. It was in the way people crossed the street when she approached, in the way store clerks barely looked up when she asked a question, in the way people would talk to her as if she weren't even there. She had seen it all before. She had accepted it. But now, with her grandson in tow, something inside her was shifting. She wasn't going to be quiet anymore. She wasn't going to let these little moments slide. Every glance, every dismissive action, every assumption made about her and her grandson, it was all part of the same system. The same system that treated black people like they didn't matter, like they were invisible. Her mind constantly returned to that nurse, to the way she had treated the boy, her harsh words, her cold demeanor, as if he wasn't even a human being. It wasn't just the nurse. No, it was the entire healthcare system, the entire structure of society that allowed people to treat others as less than. It wasn't just about a single incident. It was about the years of unspoken cruelty, the systemic racism that permeated every level of society. The boy had felt it for years, in small, quiet ways. He hadn't even fully understood it until now. But the grandmother did. She knew exactly what the boy was feeling. She knew the weight of every glance, the sting of every rejection, the quiet hum of being treated like you didn't matter. And that was why, when they were sitting in their small apartment one evening, the grandmother decided to act. She wasn't going to stay silent any longer. "Jackson," she said, her voice steady, her eyes hardening with determination. "You've been through something you shouldn't have had to go through. And I know you're feeling the weight of it, but you have to understand something, baby boy. The world isn't always going to see you for who you are. They'll look at you and they'll judge you. They'll make you feel small, make you feel like you don't matter, but you do matter. And I'm going to make sure the world knows that." The boy looked up at her, confusion written across his face. He didn't fully understand what she meant. He was just a child after all. But he trusted her. He trusted that his grandmother always knew what to do. She was the one who had always taken care of him, the one who had always made sure he felt safe and loved. "I know you don't understand all of this," she continued, her voice softer now, "but I need you to understand that you are worthy of everything. You deserve respect, you deserve kindness, and you deserve to be treated like anyone else. We've been taught to keep our heads down, to stay in the background, but that's not how it's going to be anymore. I won't let them make you feel like you're invisible." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The boy didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to respond, but he felt something inside him shift, something deep, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone anymore, like the world didn't have to be this way. The next day, the grandmother took Jackson by the hand and led him down the street to a nearby protest. It wasn't something she had done before, not in this way anyway. She had always spoken out, always made her voice heard in small ways, but this time was different. This time she wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for him. The protest was small, a few dozen people holding signs, chanting, calling for justice. But as they approached, the boy saw something in his grandmother that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the quiet strength he had always known, it was something fiercer, something that burned inside her with the intensity of a fire that had been smouldering for far too long. This wasn't just about fighting for what was right anymore. This was about reclaiming dignity, about making sure the world could no longer ignore them. She stood at the front of the crowd, raising her sign high, and Jackson watched as people began to gather around her. At first, he felt out of place, unsure of what he was supposed to do. But then, as the chants grew louder, he felt something begin to stir within him. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was a part of something bigger. He was part of this fight. The crowd's energy surged, and the boy felt his grandmother's hand tighten on his. She leaned down, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the noise of the protest seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing there, and he could see the strength in her face, the determination in her eyes. "You are seen, Jackson," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You are heard. Don't ever forget that." And for the first time in a long time, the boy believed her. Later that day, as they walked back home, Jackson's thoughts were filled with the protest and everything he had witnessed. His grandmother had stood tall, leading the charge. But it wasn't just her strength that had made an impact. It was the way the people around her had responded, the way they had rallied behind her, the way they had listened. He could see it in their faces. They weren't just there for the cause, they were there for each other. They had each other's backs. But as they walked, they passed a white woman on the sidewalk who gave them a long, hard look. She was carrying a shopping bag, walking quickly, her eyes narrowing as she passed. The grandmother's eyes never left her. The woman didn't slow down, didn't speak, but her gaze lingered just a moment too long. Jackson could feel it. He could feel the weight of her judgment, even if she said nothing. It was in her eyes, in the way she glanced back as if to ensure that they saw her, saw how uncomfortable she was. The boy instinctively pressed closer to his grandmother, not out of fear, but out of something else, a desire to stand tall, to remain unshaken. He knew that woman's glance wasn't an accident. She had judged them. She had seen them as different, less worthy of her time, her respect. The grandmother didn't flinch. She simply continued walking, her back straight, her head held high. And Jackson, for the first time, walked beside her without looking down. As the days passed, the boy's legs slowly improved. The pain wasn't gone entirely, but it was manageable, and they had an appointment to return to the doctor for further testing. But the real change wasn't in his body. The real change was in his mind. He had learned something that day, something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't enough just to survive. It wasn't enough to sit back and wait for others to make things right. He had to stand for himself, just like his grandmother had stood for him. He had to fight for his place in the world, no matter what anyone else thought. And when the next protest came, he would be there, standing beside her, loud and proud. They were no longer invisible. They were seen. And they weren't going anywhere. The days following the protest felt like an awakening. The boy, Jackson, found himself standing taller, with each step carrying more weight, more purpose. The pain in his legs had become more manageable, but it wasn't just his body that had begun to heal. It was his spirit, his sense of self. His grandmother had taught him something that day, something that couldn't be erased by the dismissive looks, the whispers, or the judgments of strangers. But that didn't mean the world had suddenly changed for him. Far from it. The next day, as they walked to the grocery store, Jackson noticed a subtle shift in the way people treated them. The looks were still there, though now they seemed more pronounced. He could feel the way the air thickened when they walked past certain people. Eyes narrowing, lips curling into tight, uncomfortable smiles. Or worse, no smile at all. It wasn't just the obvious racism, the insults, the slurs. It was the quiet, insidious kind. The kind that wasn't shouted but implied. The kind that made people like Jackson feel like they didn't belong in spaces that were supposed to be open to everyone. His grandmother noticed it too. Her eyes, always sharp, caught every subtle shift in body language, every flinch, every hesitation. She could tell when people were trying to avoid them, trying to pretend they weren't there, trying to act as if their very presence was an inconvenience. It wasn't always loud. It wasn't always obvious, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a constant reminder that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they tried to fit in, the world around them would always make them feel like outsiders. As they approached the entrance of the store, the automatic doors slid open, and they walked in together. Jackson glanced up at his grandmother, seeing the strength in her eyes, but also the weariness. She had been through this for years, this silent war against a world that refused to acknowledge her and her family as equals. But she had never let it stop her. And now she was passing that strength onto him, showing him how to stand tall, how to carry the weight of the world without letting it break him. But there was always something more. It was always more complicated than simply standing tall. Inside the store, Jackson could hear the murmurs of people nearby. He could feel their eyes on him, like something alien, something they didn't want to acknowledge. A woman walked past them, and her eyes flicked over him for a second too long. Jackson didn't know why it bothered him, but it did. It was the way her eyes lingered, as if she was trying to figure out what he was doing there, why he was allowed to be in the same space as her. It was the silent judgment that always followed him, the sense that he didn't belong. As they approached the aisles, a man stepped in front of them, blocking their path. He was tall, white, dressed in a suit that looked too expensive for someone standing in a grocery store. His presence seemed to fill the space, pushing them to the side without even realizing it. Jackson's grandmother stepped forward, her back straight, her posture unwavering. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We were here first." The man glanced at her without really looking at her. His eyes flicked over her, dismissing her in the same way so many people had done in the past. He didn't speak. He just moved forward, pushing past them as if they were invisible. His shoulder brushed against Jackson's, and in that moment the boy felt it, the weight of the insult, the unspoken message that he didn't matter, that he was in the way. Jackson felt the sting of it deep in his chest, but he didn't speak. His grandmother, however, did. "You don't get to treat us like that," she said, her voice rising just enough to catch the man's attention. He paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder with a look of disdain. "What's your problem?" he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "My problem is, you think you can walk all over people like us," the grandmother replied, her voice unwavering. "Like we don't have the same right to be here as anyone else. You think you're better than us, don't you?" The man narrowed his eyes, sizing her up as if deciding whether or not she was worth the effort of an argument. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice dismissive, but there was an edge of annoyance now. "You're talking down to me and my grandson like we don't belong here, like we're not worthy of your time." "That's what I'm talking about," she said. "I'm not going to stand by and let you treat us like we're invisible." There was a brief moment of silence between them, the tension thick enough to cut through the air. Jackson could feel the man's eyes on him now, but he refused to look away. He wasn't going to be afraid anymore. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. The man looked down at him, his eyes narrowing with disdain, and Jackson could feel it. Every ounce of contempt he had for them, for him. But his grandmother didn't back down. She stood firm, not allowing him to intimidate them. Finally, the man let out a huff and walked away, muttering something under his breath. He didn't say anything more, but the damage had been done. The unspoken message was clear. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he felt the weight of the world pressing in on him. The weight of being treated as less than. The weight of carrying that burden every single day. But his grandmother wasn't done. She turned to him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You see what just happened?" she asked, her voice steady but fierce. "He tried to make us feel small, tried to make us invisible, but we don't let them. Do you hear me, Jackson?" He nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't have the words to explain what he was feeling, but he understood what she meant. The world would keep pushing. It would keep trying to make him feel like he didn't matter, but he wasn't going to let it break him. He wasn't going to let them win. As they continued down the aisle, the boy felt the weight of everything. The judgment, the assumptions, the looks. They were all there, hovering just beneath the surface, ready to strike again. But the grandmother's voice in his ear, her strength, her unwavering belief in him, it was like a shield. "Don't ever forget, Jackson," she said, her voice soft now. "You are worthy of everything. You are worthy of respect. Don't let them take that from you." The words settled deep in his heart. It was the first time he had truly understood what his grandmother had been teaching him. It wasn't enough to just survive. It wasn't enough to keep his head down. He had to fight. He had to make sure the world knew who he was. He had to stand tall. But the world didn't make it easy. Later that day, as they headed back home, the boy's grandmother took him by the hand, walking beside him with purpose. They passed more people, and again the looks came, the glances, the way people turned their heads, as if trying to avoid acknowledging their presence. But Jackson didn't flinch this time. He didn't look away. He kept his head high, walking beside his grandmother as if nothing could stop him. And maybe, just maybe, nothing could. The weight of every rejection, every glance, every judgment was still there, but it no longer felt like it was crushing him. It no longer felt like it could break him, because now he understood. He wasn't invisible, not anymore. He was seen, and he would make sure the world saw him. It was another Tuesday when Jackson's world shifted again. But this time, it wasn't the sting of a stranger's cold shoulder or a dismissive glance from someone passing by. This time, it was in the very place where they should have been safest, the school. Jackson had been attending the local elementary school for the past few months. His grandmother had been hesitant at first, knowing that children, with their innocence, could often be the cruelest. She had made sure to prepare him for the subtle ways racism would show up in his life. How some kids would call him names, how teachers might favor others, how he might be overlooked because of the color of his skin. She had tried to teach him resilience, to hold his head high and let the hurt bounce off him, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. She never expected the school to be as unforgiving as it was. Jackson had spent the morning sitting in the back of the classroom, trying his best to stay focused. He liked school, he liked learning, but he knew from the moment he entered the classroom that he was different. The other kids were quick to form groups, to make friends with each other, and Jackson always found himself on the edges of their conversations, never quite fitting in. It was lunchtime when it all came crashing down. He was standing in line, waiting to get his food, when a group of kids, a few of the ones who had always made him feel like an outsider, started whispering. At first, he didn't notice, but when he heard the laughter, he couldn't ignore it anymore. "Look at him!" one of the boys said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the line to hear. "Is he actually going to eat that?" Jackson looked down at his tray, his stomach tightening. He hadn't even realized that the food on his tray, a simple peanut butter sandwich and a carton of milk, was being scrutinized. But the way they were looking at him, the way they were laughing at him, made him feel small. The way the boys' words cut through the air like a sharp blade made him wish he could disappear. He tried to ignore it, to keep his eyes on the tray in front of him, but the whispers continued. "Why does he get a peanut butter sandwich? Is that all they feed them?" Another voice piped up, its tone dripping with disdain. The laughter grew louder, and Jackson felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face them, but the whispers were everywhere, echoing in his ears. One of the girls in the group spoke next, her voice high-pitched and mocking. "I bet he doesn't even know how to eat like us. Maybe that's why he's always sitting alone." That was when Jackson felt the familiar sickening twist in his stomach. The same twist he had felt countless times before, but this time it was worse. This time it was like they were dissecting every piece of him, the way he looked, the food he ate, the very essence of who he was. He wasn't just being made fun of for being different, he was being dehumanized. The group of children snickered, their eyes flicking between Jackson and each other, their words more hurtful with every passing second. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight back. All he wanted was for it to stop, for them to just leave him alone. But they didn't. Jackson's eyes darted around the room, hoping to find some sign of help, but his teacher, Mrs. Allen, was busy talking to another student. The lunchroom monitor, who should have been watching for these kinds of things, was distracted by her phone. Jackson was alone. He had always been told that school was a place of safety, a place where everyone should be treated equally. But now he felt the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. It wasn't a safe place for him, not really. The kids didn't want him there. They didn't want him to be part of their world. To them, he was different, and in their eyes, being different meant he didn't belong. "Jackson," the boy who had started it all said again, his voice laced with a cruel edge. "What, you think you're too good for us? Too good for peanut butter?" Jackson's breath caught in his throat. The words stung in a way that he couldn't fully describe. It wasn't just about the food. It was about being seen as less. It was about the assumptions people made about him because of his skin. It was about the fact that they could laugh at him without ever knowing him. And the worst part was, no one stepped in. No teacher, no adult, no other student came to his defense. He was left alone, standing there, fighting an invisible battle that no one else seemed to see. Finally, Mrs. Allen walked by, noticing the tension in the air, but she didn't address the problem. She simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. Jackson stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. He had no words. He didn't know how to respond. But then, just as he was about to turn and leave the lunch line, his grandmother appeared at the door. She had come to pick him up early, as they had an appointment later that afternoon. But when she walked into the lunchroom, she immediately noticed the tension. She saw the way Jackson's shoulders were slumped, the way he was trying to avoid eye contact with the group of kids who had made fun of him. She could see the hurt in his eyes, and her heart ached for him. Without a word, she walked over to him, her gaze moving across the room, locking eyes with the kids who had been tormenting him. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall as always, her presence filling the room. Jackson's classmates fell silent as she approached, and the laughter that had echoed so loudly just moments ago died down to a quiet murmur. "Jackson," she said, her voice calm but full of quiet authority. "Let's go. We don't need to be here." The boy's eyes met his grandmother's, and for the first time all day, he felt a sense of relief. She was there. She was standing up for him, not just in private, but in front of everyone. She wasn't afraid to let people see the strength she had. And in that moment, Jackson knew he wasn't alone. As they walked out of the lunchroom, the group of children behind them didn't say a word. Their silence was louder than any insult they had thrown at him. It was the silence of shame. The silence of people who knew they had crossed a line but weren't brave enough to admit it. Outside, as they walked toward the car, Jackson didn't speak right away. He felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, the exhaustion of fighting an invisible battle. But his grandmother didn't let him stay silent. "I know it hurts, baby," she said, her voice soft now. "I know what they said. I know what they did. But don't you ever let them make you feel small. You are so much more than the way they treat you. You are stronger than they'll ever understand." Jackson looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears, but his heart swelling with something else, something that made him stand a little taller, walk a little prouder. The sting of their words still hurt, but the fire inside him had been lit. "They don't know me," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "They don't know anything about me." "No, they don't," his grandmother agreed, pulling him into a hug. "And they never will, because you, Jackson, are something they'll never understand. You have a power inside you that they will never see, and that's what scares them." As they drove home that day, Jackson didn't feel defeated anymore. He still felt the sting of the words, the rejection, but he felt something else rising within him, something he hadn't felt before. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't a burden. He was a person. And no matter how much they tried to make him feel small, he would keep fighting to be seen. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more moments like this, more encounters where he would be treated unfairly, where people would try to push him aside. But he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them win, because now Jackson understood something that would stay with him forever. He was worth fighting for. The next few days passed slowly for Jackson, his heart heavy with the memories of the confrontation at school. Though his legs didn't hurt as much anymore, it seemed like the pain in his chest was only growing. The subtle slights and quiet cruelties that he faced daily at school, the whispered jokes behind his back, the way his classmates still looked at him like he didn't belong. It all had a weight. It was a different kind of weight, one that wasn't so easy to ignore. The worst part was how it felt like everyone was watching, waiting for him to slip, to give in to the pressure. He could see the way people looked at him in the hallways, the way teachers sometimes glanced at him with a forced smile, a kindness that felt like it was painted on, as if they were pretending to care. At home, his grandmother could tell that something had shifted in him. She watched him carefully, as always, but she wasn't blind to the silent way he had started withdrawing. It wasn't just the school, though. It was everything. It was the quiet judgment in the eyes of strangers, the unspoken prejudice that hung in the air like an invisible cloud. She had seen it all before, but now, with Jackson, it was different. The world wasn't just seeing him for who he was. It was seeing him through a lens of assumptions, prejudices, and hate. One afternoon, after Jackson came back from school, his grandmother sat him down at the kitchen table. Her eyes were sharp, but kind. Her voice full of the wisdom she had accumulated through years of living in a world that had tried its best to break her. "Jackson," she said softly, her hands resting on the table, "I know it's been hard. I know how people treat you. But I want you to listen to me very carefully. What they say about you, how they look at you, it doesn't define who you are. Not even close." Jackson was silent, his eyes focused on his hands twisting nervously. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the weight of their words and their looks wouldn't matter, but it was hard. It was hard to walk through the hallways, hard to sit in class, to hear the whispers and feel the eyes on him. Sometimes he felt like there was no escape from it. "I'm not like you, Grandma," he said quietly. "I can't just walk around like I don't care. I don't know how you do it." His grandmother smiled gently, her voice never wavering. "Because I've lived a lifetime of it, Jackson. I've lived a lifetime of being ignored, of being treated like I don't belong. And I've learned that the only thing that matters is how I see myself. You don't need to make them see you the way you want them to. You just need to be true to yourself. Jackson looked up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. But it hurts. Every day. It's like I can't escape it. She reached over, placing her hand over his, her touch warm and reassuring. I know, baby. I know. And that hurt, that weight you carry, it's something you'll feel for a long time. But listen to me. What matters is how you stand in the face of it. You don't have to fight every battle. Some of them aren't worth it. But the ones that matter, those are the ones you fight for, and you don't have to fight alone. The words hung in the air for a moment. Jackson sat quietly, thinking about what she said. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it easier. The sting of every joke, every comment, every glance. It was something that stayed with him, lingering, no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. Underscore. Underscore, 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 underscore. The next day at school, the tension felt heavier than ever. Jackson walked into his first period, trying to keep his head down, trying to make himself as small as possible. He wasn't sure if it was the looks he was getting from his classmates or the distant coldness from his teacher, but something felt different. It was like they were all waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to break. As he made his way to his desk, he caught a glimpse of some of the other kids whispering. Their eyes flickered toward him, and Jackson felt a wave of unease wash over him. He sat down quickly, trying to ignore the feeling, trying to bury it deep inside where no one could see it. But it was there, pushing at him, clawing at his chest. The day dragged on, and with each class, Jackson felt more isolated. The whispers didn't stop. The looks didn't fade. It was as if he was trapped in a world where no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried to fit in, there was always something different about him. Always something that made him stand out. At lunch, Jackson sat alone at the back of the cafeteria. He wasn't surprised. He had gotten used to this. It was easier than trying to force his way into conversations that he knew weren't meant for him. He pushed his food around on his tray, not really hungry, but not able to bring himself to leave. He could feel the weight of eyes on him again, the stares that followed him as he sat by himself. It was as if he was a specimen in a glass jar, being observed but never truly seen. But today was different. Today, there was a shift in the air, a tension that felt thicker than usual. Jackson could feel it, could sense that something was about to happen. He didn't know what it was, but his stomach twisted as he sat there, waiting. And then it happened. A voice broke through the murmur of the cafeteria. "Hey, Jackson!" one of the boys from his class called out, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Are you sure you're even supposed to be sitting here? I mean, this is for the real students, right?" The laughter that followed was immediate, a high-pitched cackle that made Jackson's skin crawl. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of their words settled over him like a fog. Jackson didn't know what to do. He wanted to stand up, to shout back, to tell them how wrong they were. But he didn't. He stayed silent, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his face burning with embarrassment and anger. "Yeah, you don't really belong here, do you?" Another voice chimed in, one that he recognized from gym class. The laughter spread through the room like wildfire, and Jackson felt it. The heat of their judgment, the sting of their words. It was like they were stripping him down, taking away everything he had tried to hold on to. Just as Jackson felt like he was going to sink into the floor, a voice interrupted, a voice that he didn't expect. "That's enough." It was Mrs. Allen, his teacher, standing at the edge of the cafeteria, her face set in a stern expression. She had heard the commotion and had come to stop it, but Jackson could tell by the way she held herself that this wasn't just about the moment. This was about something bigger, something that had been allowed to go on for far too long. "Jackson doesn't need to prove anything to you," Mrs. Allen continued, her voice carrying across the room. "You will all treat each other with respect. No more jokes, no more slurs. If I hear anything like this again, there will be consequences." The room went silent. Jackson could feel the eyes on him, but this time it was different. This time there was no laughter, no mocking. There was just silence. The kind of silence that comes after something has been exposed, after the truth has been laid bare. For the first time, Jackson felt like someone was standing up for him. For the first time, he felt like his worth wasn't just something to be ignored or belittled. Mrs. Allen's intervention hadn't solved everything. The kids who had mocked him still stared at him with disdain. But there was something that shifted in that moment. It wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a sign that it wasn't going to be fought alone. As lunch ended, Jackson stood up to leave, his tray in hand. But before he could walk away, Mrs. Allen caught his eye. She nodded toward the door, a subtle, reassuring gesture. "Don't let them get to you, Jackson," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You're worth so much more than their words." He nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that had been building inside him since his grandmother first spoke to him about standing tall. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was being seen. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't nothing. He was worthy. And with that thought in his mind, he walked out of the cafeteria, his head held high, his grandmother's voice echoing in his ears. He wasn't done fighting. He wasn't done standing tall. This was just the beginning. The weeks after the cafeteria incident were a strange mix of emotions for Jackson. It was like nothing had really changed, yet everything had. He still walked into school each day with the same heaviness on his heart. The whispers, the looks, the isolation, it was still there. But there was something else too. There was a quiet sense of strength, something that had begun to grow inside him since his grandmother had taught him to stand tall. It wasn't about being loud or confronting everyone who looked at him the wrong way. It was about carrying himself with confidence, about not letting the stares and the comments define him. At home, his grandmother kept reinforcing that lesson. "The world will try to break you down, Jackson," she'd say, "but they can't take away your dignity. They can't take away your worth." She had been through so much in her life, far more than Jackson could ever truly understand, but she never let it consume her. She had always fought to keep her dignity intact, and now she was teaching him to do the same. One afternoon, Jackson and his grandmother were sitting in the living room, the soft hum of the TV in the background. It was a rare moment of quiet after a long day. Jackson had just returned from school, his bag slung over his shoulder, his feet tired, but his mind wide awake. "Grandma," he said, his voice tentative, "why do people treat me like that? Why do they look at me like I'm different?" His grandmother turned to face him, her eyes soft but serious. "People will look at you, baby. They'll judge you based on what they see on the outside. They'll think they know you, but they don't. And it's not your job to make them understand. You just have to keep walking your path with your head held high." Jackson thought about that for a moment, feeling the weight of her words sink in. It wasn't easy, of course. The stares, the comments, the moments when he felt like he didn't belong. They weren't just going to disappear, but what his grandmother was telling him was that he didn't have to let them take control of his life. He didn't have to let their judgments become his truth. The next day at school, things seemed to go back to normal. Normal in the sense that the usual stares and quiet whispers followed him through the hallways. He'd been keeping his head down, trying to focus on his classes and not letting the noise around him distract him. But as he walked to his locker, he noticed something different. It wasn't a whisper or a stare this time. It was a hand on his shoulder. He turned around quickly, startled, only to see a familiar face. It was his classmate, Liam. Liam had never really paid attention to Jackson before. He had always been part of the group that barely acknowledged him, that walked past him like he wasn't even there. But now there was something different in Liam's eyes. It wasn't mockery, and it wasn't pity. It was something new. "Hey, Jackson," Liam said, his voice a bit hesitant, as if he wasn't sure what to say. "I wanted to apologize for what happened the other day in the cafeteria. I didn't say anything, but I should have." Jackson blinked, not sure if he was hearing things right. Liam, of all people, was apologizing. This was a kid who had never really acknowledged him before, who had laughed along with others when Jackson had been the target of their jokes. Jackson had never thought of him as someone who would ever take the time to make things right. I don't know what came over me," Liam continued, his voice quiet but sincere. "I guess I just got caught up in it. I never should have let it go that far." Jackson didn't know how to respond. For a moment, he stood there, speechless. His mind was racing. Was this some kind of joke? Was Liam just trying to save face? But no, Jackson could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't about saving face. This was about accountability. This was about Liam recognizing his own role in the way things had played out. "It's fine," Jackson said after a long pause, his voice steady. "I get it." Liam looked at him, surprised. "No, it's not fine. I shouldn't have let it happen. I'm sorry." Jackson nodded. It wasn't the apology he expected, but it was the one he needed. Sometimes it wasn't about grand gestures or big moments. It was about small, quiet steps. And this was a step forward. The two of them stood there for a moment in silence, the noise of the hallway buzzing around them. Jackson could feel something shifting. It wasn't the world changing all at once, but it was a change. It was one person, in one moment, deciding to do better. Underscore, 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 underscore. After that exchange with Liam, Jackson's thoughts were occupied with the idea of change. He couldn't deny the truth of it. The world around him had to change, but he couldn't control it all. What he could control was how he responded, how he carried himself. He could choose to be a part of that change, not just wait for it to happen. A few days later, Jackson's grandmother took him to another protest, a community event organized to raise awareness about racial injustice and inequality. It wasn't something Jackson had expected at first, but as they stood among the crowd, he began to feel the power of what was happening around him. People from all walks of life were there, standing together for something bigger than themselves, something that transcended individual pain. There was a strength in numbers, a unity that made Jackson feel like he wasn't alone anymore. His grandmother stood beside him, her voice joining the chants that filled the air. Jackson looked around at the faces in the crowd, black, white, Latino, Asian, all standing together for a cause that mattered. For the first time, Jackson felt like he was part of something important. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He wasn't just a kid struggling to fit in. He was a part of a movement, a part of something much bigger than himself. That night, when they returned home, Jackson sat down on the couch beside his grandmother, his mind still buzzing with the energy of the day. He couldn't help but think about everything he had learned. He was starting to understand that change didn't come in grand, sweeping moments. It came in the small things. It came in standing tall, in confronting the hurtful words, in forgiving when forgiveness was needed, and in calling out the injustice when it was right in front of him. He turned to his grandmother, who was sitting beside him, her eyes soft and proud. "Grandma," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if I'm ready to change the whole world, but maybe, just maybe, I can start with me." His grandmother smiled at him, a warm, knowing smile. "That's where it starts, Jackson. It starts with you. And with every step you take, every word you speak, every time you stand up for what's right, you're changing the world a little bit." Jackson nodded, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living with purpose, with integrity, with the belief that no matter what the world tried to throw at him, he had the strength to rise above it. The fight wasn't over, far from it, but in that moment, Jackson understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was worth fighting for. And so were the people he loved. And with that understanding came the power to stand tall, no matter what came next. The world was still full of challenges, but Jackson knew that he wasn't facing them alone. He had his grandmother by his side, and he had a community behind him, supporting him every step of the way. And for the first time, that was enough. Jackson sat by the window, looking out over the neighborhood with his thoughts racing. The world felt a little different now, quieter somehow, though he knew that the struggles he faced every day were still there, just beneath the surface. But there was a sense of peace in him that hadn't been there before. A peace that came from understanding who he was and the strength he had within. It had been several months since the protest, and things at school had slowly begun to shift. The whispers and the glances still existed, of course, but they had lost their power. People had started to treat him differently. There were still the moments when he felt like an outsider, when the looks from his classmates lingered just a little too long. But now he held his head a little higher. His grandmother's words were like a steady pulse in his mind. You are worth more than their words. You are more than their judgment. The day had started like any other, but something was different. Jackson could feel it in the air. There was a sense of anticipation, like something was about to happen, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. At school, he noticed that the usual group of boys who had mocked him in the past were gathered by the entrance. They were laughing, talking amongst themselves, but this time, Jackson didn't feel that familiar knot in his stomach. He wasn't afraid of them anymore. He didn't fear their words or their judgment. He had learned something his grandmother had always known. The people who judged him didn't define him. As Jackson passed by them, one of the boys, Alex, called out to him, "Hey, Jackson, you still think you're better than us, huh?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement designed to provoke. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at them. He kept walking, the sound of his footsteps echoing in his ears, and with each step, he could feel the weight of their gaze falling away from him. "Didn't think so," Alex muttered, though his words didn't have the same bite they once did. There was something in his tone that Jackson couldn't quite place. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was something else entirely. Jackson's thoughts shifted as he entered the classroom. The usual tension was in the air. Some of his classmates gave him a wide berth, while others seemed eager to avoid eye contact altogether. But then, something strange happened. As he walked to his desk, Mrs. Allen, the teacher who had once intervened in the cafeteria, caught his eye. She smiled at him, just a small, reassuring smile, but it made all the difference. It reminded him that not everyone saw him as the other. Some people saw him for who he truly was. The bell rang and the class settled into their routine. Jackson sat quietly, focusing on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud sound of the door opening. It was a surprise visitor, another teacher, but this one was different. It was Mr. Davis, the school principal, who had only come to visit Jackson's class once or twice before. His presence in the room made everyone pause. Jackson could feel the eyes on him, and for a brief moment it felt like the air had thickened, like something heavy was about to fall. Mr. Davis walked to the front of the class, his expression serious. "Class, I'd like to take a moment to talk about something important. I've heard that there has been some tension between students recently, and we need to address it. We cannot, and we will not tolerate any form of racism or bullying at this school. Not now, not ever." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know where this was going, but he had a feeling. He could feel the eyes of his classmates shifting nervously. Some were pretending to look down, avoiding the conversation altogether. Others, like Alex, seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. "We will be starting a program to address these issues," Mr. Davis continued, his voice steady and firm. "Students who engage in discriminatory behavior will be held accountable. It's time for this school to make real change, and I expect all of you to be a part of it." Jackson couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Was this happening for real? Was he finally going to be heard? His mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm, to stay focused. He was no longer the scared child who had hidden in the background. He was stronger now. And this was his moment. The next few weeks brought more change than Jackson could have anticipated. The school had implemented workshops and open discussions about racism, about privilege, and about the importance of empathy. It wasn't a quick fix, and it didn't erase everything, but it was a start. It was the first step in the long road of change. As part of the new program, students were assigned to speak on the issues they had been dealing with, to share their stories. Jackson didn't know if he was ready for that, but he knew he had to speak up. It was time. It was his time. When it was his turn to speak, Jackson stood in front of the class, feeling the weight of every eye on him. He had never felt so exposed. But then he thought about his grandmother, about everything she had taught him. He thought about how far he had come, about how many times he had been knocked down and how many times he had stood up again. He took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and began. "I've been treated differently my whole life," Jackson said, his voice steady, but his heart pounding. "People look at me and think they know who I am, just by looking at the color of my skin. I've been called names, ignored, and made to feel like I don't belong. and I've carried that with me for a long time. The room was silent. Jackson could see his classmates shifting uncomfortably, but he didn't look away. He kept speaking. Every time I walk into a room, I wonder if people are judging me, if they see me for who I am, or if they just see the color of my skin. It hurts. It really does. But I've learned that I can't let it break me. I'm not invisible. I'm not less than. I'm not going to hide anymore. As Jackson spoke, he saw something shift in the room. He saw the kids who had once laughed at him, who had once treated him as an outsider, look at him differently. There was a flicker of understanding, a flicker of guilt. They had heard him. They had seen him for the first time. When he finished, the room was still quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a respectful silence, one that felt like the first step toward understanding. Jackson sat down, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had spoken his truth, and he knew that things weren't perfect, that there was still work to be done. But today, for the first time, he felt like things were finally beginning to change. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, as Jackson sat at the kitchen table with his grandmother, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. She was smiling at him, a small, proud smile that made his heart swell. "I'm proud of you, Jackson," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You spoke up when it mattered. You showed them what it means to be strong, to be proud of who you are. You've done more than most people will ever understand." Jackson looked at her, his heart full. "I don't think I could have done it without you," he said softly. "You've taught me everything I need to know." His grandmother reached out, pulling him into a hug. "No, baby. You've taught yourself. You've always had it in you. I'm just here to remind you of what you already know." In that moment, Jackson realized something. He didn't need the world to change overnight. He didn't need everyone to understand. What mattered was that he understood himself. He was strong. He was proud. He was worthy. And with that, the world seemed a little less heavy. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did it impact you, and how did you find the strength to rise above it? Your experiences are incredibly valuable, and we want to remind you that you matter. We appreciate every one of you who engages with us. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It really helps us continue to bring meaningful stories to you. We hope you have a wonderful day ahead. Also, let us know you listened to the end by commenting the phrase, "I stand with dignity." We look forward to reading your thoughts.